Hello and welcome to the debate. I'm your host Sana Maqbool with you at B2B World. In today's show, we're going to be taking a look at the current situation both in Pakistan and the world over. The first segment is going to be taking a look at the economic situation of the country and, of course, with reference to the kind of discussions that have been putting forward with regards to the budget that the government has come out with. There is, of course, the impact that this has created, not just in terms of the responses that have been coming from different quarters in Pakistan, but also in terms of the effect that this will have on the talks with the IMF, in which, of course, Pakistan aims to secure a bailout package of 6 to 8 billion. And so we're going to be taking a look at what this means, particularly in terms of how this will affect these talks and what sort of conditions or demands by the IMF have either been met or can actually be negotiated with. And also in terms of the way that this is impacting the current economic situation in the country, especially in terms of the way that people are going to be responding to this and, of course, the way it's going to affect their daily lives. There is, of course, a lot of talk with regards to widening the tax base with an ambitious target of tax collection as well that the government has set up. What exactly is going to be the way forward and the measures that the government will be taking in this regard are going to be of utmost importance. And then, of course, the way that this is going to impact the poor segments of the society and what plans the government has to offer that, and then, of course, move forward with development and progress. There is also, of course, the impact that this is going to have on the political situation of the country and the way that we have seen the political consequences also affect the discussions around the budget and the budgetary sessions as well, and the way that different political parties, of course, as part of this government have to interact with each other and require each other's support. What will be the future of this particular setup, and how exactly will different political parties be able to move forward with these alliances and make sure that they are putting forward a collective stance with regards to issues that affect Pakistan. We're also going to be taking a look in our show in terms of a more focused look at the political situation in Punjab with Section 144 being imposed. There is no clear reason that is being given for this particular decision, but of course many have been pointing towards linkages with announcements made by the PTI and its workers with regards to nationwide protests in Pakistan for, of course, their founder and leader that has been jailed for quite some time now. So we're going to be taking a look at what this means, especially in terms of its impact on the political situation of the country and whether or not this is going to be of serious concern to the government. At the end of the show, we're also going to be taking a closer look at what has been coming in terms of rhetoric and statements from India regarding the assassination of ex-army officer Brigadier Retired Mr. Amir Hamza, which, of course, is a very tragic and unfortunate incident that took place within this week. And there's, of course, a lot of concern that is being raised in terms of the campaign that is being led by India in order to malign him and falsely accuse him of being involved in operations in Indian occupied Jammu and Kashmir. So we're going to be taking a closer look at the statements that have been coming in from India and uncover the truth for the audience. That is going to be our focus in the show today. For this and more, as always, in the studios, I've been joined by senior analysts Farrukh K.Pitafi and Raja Faisal. And we've also been joined online for our first segment on economy by Dr. Mahmood Khalid, who's a senior economist, and Mr. Yousuf Farrooq, who's directed research, trade studies. Thank you very much, gentlemen, for being part of the discussion and joining us in the show today. Dr. Mahmood, I'll start with you with reference to your perspective, particularly on the budget announcements and, of course, the very large issue of with regards to the tax collection targets and, of course, the way that the government plans to actually widening the tax base and then, of course, move forward with talks with the IMF. First of all, of course, your overall perspective on the kind of policies and numbers that have been given within this budget. And then, of course, the way you think that this will be able, the way the government will be able to navigate this both within the public domain in Pakistan and then, of course, with the IMF.
Well, thank you, Sana, for having me here. A very ambitious budget, I would say, because if you look at the numbers, then both on the expenditure side and the financing side, the assumptions have been very high in terms of getting possibly the maximum revenue on the basis of which they are going to set up a very ambitious expenditure plan as well. So if we go very minutely in terms of the numbers which they have proposed, they have put up a budget of close to more than 18 trillion worth rupees, and the financing has been set at close to 13 trillion rupees. So this is the biggest budget so far in terms of both the revenue collection and the expenditures. But if you go into the details, then what one misses to see is the kind of reforms which were expected, because we are looking forward for an engagement with the IMF in the 24th program. So what we were expecting, that there would be severe cuts in terms of the expenditures as well as the tax base enhancement measures which they have proposed before the budgets, that this is something which they are going to work on. So the details are coming, and since the budget is in under discussion, we are expecting that many things are going to improve, especially on the side of the expenditures, because if you look at the subsidies and the grants and transfers and the other expenditures such as the pensions, they are very big. And given the resource availability, I seriously think that so these numbers needs to be reconsidered, or at least some kind of adjustment in terms of how they're going to be financed needs to be seen into it.
Right. There is, of course, a lot of conversation with regards to what this would eventually mean in terms of impact on the people. And while we, of course, talk about increasing the tax base, and as you said, seems to be an ambitious target, I want to also understand whether you think that the requisite reforms or the structural changes are also in place or are planned for the future to actually make that happen and not have the kind of impact that it may possibly have on people who are existing taxpayers or sectors who are existing taxpayers, and what exactly will then be the strategy in terms of making sure that there is no inflationary impact and instead we are looking for a longer term solution.
And Dr. Saab, given that at the start you have mentioned that the total outlay is 18 trillion, out of which 1 trillion goes to pensions. Now the question is whether there was any reform proposal regarding that or not, because that is one hell of a big liability that the government of Pakistan is actually looking at.
Well, to take the question of Sana first, in terms of how good the plan is in terms of collecting more than 40% additional revenues from the existing base. To be very honest, the plan is not very well articulated. There are a number of caveats which one has to see. For example, they have proposed that there is going to be distinction in terms of the filer, non-filer, by increasing the rates to an extent which means practically that the non-filers are not going to come on board. On the other side, they have proposed measures such as taking out the facility of having no capital gains tax after the 5th year of holding the asset. So irrespective of holding the asset period, whether for 1 year or for more than 5 years, it is going to be the same in terms of 15% rate of taxation. But the good things have been such as that they have asked the exporters that the zero rating or the exemptions regime has now been taken away, and they have to actually shoulder 1% of their income which they are earning as their exports to the government, because this is a high time that they should also contribute. But on the face of it, the requisite 40% growth in the taxes is practically not outlaid in terms of how it is going to be achieved. They have talked about that they're going to take in the retail sector. They're also going to work in terms of the missing sectors such as real estate, that they are going to be brought into the tax net. But the problem is that the FBR fails to understand that the system is so complex that it's not that the rates which or the bases which are running away from the system, it's the system's complexity overall which makes the people to shy away from it. For example, they have increased the non-salaried class highest marginal rate from a lower side of close to 27% to higher side of the 45%. Now that essentially would, as per their expectation, means that they're going to be more revenue. But what we fear is that this is going to actually pull out the people out of the system, because the FPR's compliance rate has not been very good. So what we feel is that the ambition is very high, but the requisite homework which should have been there in terms of laying out the complete plan of action and solid grounds on which it is going to be formed. Like, for example, we have talked about it in our earlier discussions as well, that the withholding tax regimes, instead of taking it out of the system or at least reducing the number of the withholding taxes, they actually increased the withholding taxes on a number of other sectors which were not in the system. They have increased the sales tax rate from 15 to 18% on the end-to-end automated and documented sectors of the textile and leather, such as the big names which were therein. And they actually got themselves enrolled in this system because there was a trust given to them that your GST would be less than as compared to those POS in which the end-to-end documentation is not there. So that actually is going to take away the trust from these businesses, because earlier they were taken on board that your GST is going to be less than the normal tax regime and it is going to be 15%. Now they have been put again back to the 18%. So that kind of a policy in terms of losing the trust of the taxpayers and putting higher tax burden on the existing taxpayers is actually not going to get us near to the target. Rather, it's going to pull us back, and this is something which was really missing. On the second point, on the pension side, again, you have mentioned that the reforms were talked about. They said that there is going to be a defined contribution system, but the details have not been given. Would it be for the new entrants into the system, or for the existing beneficiaries of the system would also be put on the same kind of pension system? Because if you look at the expenditure outlay, as you have mentioned, it's 1 trillion just for the federal government. And if you take all the provincial governments across the board, then I believe that this is going to be even higher number than the interest payments which the government is making right now.
Yeah, Sana, with your permission, I wanted to go towards Yousuf. Yousuf, my question to you is, of course, we are looking at a scenario where, of course, government is going towards a fresh program with the IMF, and we have been hearing this from our finance minister as well in recent past, that of course we are heading towards a fresh program of $6 to $8 billion with the IMF. In that context, of course, we know that if we are heading towards that with this current budget, we have to, of course, expand the volume of our current economy as well. In that context, can we say that the current budget is going to be crucial and quite helpful for, of course, the ambitions we have related to covering up all of the interest of the new program which we are going to initiate with the IMF?
I think the budget has been made considering all of the requirements of the IMF, but there are a few things that are very disappointing in the budget. Like, even if you read the Moody's report that was published a day after the budget, they also said that there has been no effort to curb expenditure. This budget is no doubt going to be inflationary. Like Dr. Saab mentioned, there are some direct ways in which this is going to be inflationary. Sales tax has been increased in some places. Additional withholding tax on retailers, which is not going to bring them into the net, but it's just going to increase. It's just going to increase prices in the market for goods. The other thing that I think that is not being talked about enough is that the fiscal deficit target is 7.2 trillion rupees. And if we look at what's happened over the last couple of years, the central bank has had to print this money and inject it through open market operations. And that is, of course, inflationary, because if you have to print 5, 6, 7, 8 trillion rupees and push them into the economy, with the banks lending this money to the government and then the government paying this money out, I think this is not being talked about enough. So I think there was a need to control the overall fiscal deficit along with trying to get a primary surplus target. I think it's extremely important for Pakistan to get an IMF program, which is why the government has targeted a primary surplus this time. But I think the overall deficit is something that also should be talked about, because we're printing too much money every year, which has been extremely inflationary. So there's going to be a direct impact of inflation, and then all of this additional money being pumped into the economy by the government in a year when we've just gotten out of an inflation shock. I think this is also something that should be considered. So,
right, absolutely. Yes, go ahead.
Finish the thought.
So there isn't much that the government can do, to be honest. I think that if everyone would have just seen some effort to curb expenditures, like a symbolic cut in the Prime Minister's office's budget or a symbolic cut in some other expense. I think it made no sense in a year when you have to increase taxes on salaries to increase government employees' salaries by 20 and 25%. Inflation last year has been close to 12% over the last 12 months. What was the point of increasing salaries by so much?
Right, and
That's one thing.
Point, once again, Yousuf, that is a very good point. But regarding what you are saying, when you actually said that expenditure remains a serious issue, at that time I thought that you are perhaps not going to talk about certain symbolic cuts in the PM office's expenditure, but you are going to talk about freezing of PSDP for 1 year. That seems to be a challenge in coming days, and yet not many people are talking about it, that PSDP has grown and it will get more allocations.
I think the country can't really afford to completely freeze PSDP allocations also, because PSDP, like you mentioned earlier, PSDP also generates a lot of activity in the economy. So like PSDP is a long-term plan. So like some stuff has to be done every year to maintain a lot of infrastructure, and a lot of new infrastructure needs to be built every year in Pakistan, because the population grows every year and there are new needs every year. But yes, you're right. I think the PSDP target is too high, and I think this is exactly what's going to happen towards the end of the year. If you look at what's happened over the last 2-3 years, so you'll see that there have been large amounts of public sector development spending, and then the whole allocated amount does not get spent. So it's not necessary that this amount gets spent. I think
you spoke about long-term investment, and here's the breakdown for you. IMF's report last year actually pointed out that it takes somewhere around 12.1 year for every PSDP program to actually mature, and that is also an engine of corruption. So don't you think that we could actually do away with that kind of expenditure for 1 year at least, rather than raising taxes?
I think if we look at this overall expense, close to 1% of GDP, so it's not a very large expense. I think all of this can be funded if we can somehow get rid of PIA and steel mill and all of the other loss-making government enterprises that have to be funded every year. So these are enterprises that don't need to be funded, and the government does not have to stay in businesses that it should not be running. The government has constantly been trying to run businesses, and it has failed in doing so.
Right. I'm glad you mentioned the SOEs, because I want Khalid sahab, your take on that as well, particularly, of course, with we're moving forward with the national airlines. And it seems, of course, that there is still about a month more to go to get more bids. But it seems that many have been disappointed by the numbers in terms of the kind of collection that this will actually raise. And of course, there are other hindrances involved as to when this will actually materialize and when we'll actually get to see it. So I want your perspective on that as well, that while we talk about privatization of SOEs, how much are we gaining from this, and what eventually will happen, considering that we haven't really, we are not close to that happening right now. Also, with regards to an important sector in terms of collection, as we were talking earlier, and in terms of taxing different sectors, there's always been the real estate that we've mentioned many times previously as well. But again, this seems to be something that the government is also moving forward in perhaps a more protective way, and has said that it's resisting IMF demands of taxing it the normal income tax rate. Do you think that that's something that's wise, and or that's something that's beneficial for the country, especially when we're moving ahead with talks and we want to increase our tax collection?
Let me piggyback on that one, because you mentioned that if you keep on increasing the tax rate, there is going to be significant dropout of the tax net. And something very interesting happened recently when the government actually went after people who are not filing returns. The list they actually came up with was about people who have at least once filed a return in past 3 years. So, and now the government is cracking down on them. So is it not then quite visible to anybody who has not part of that tax net, that if I become part of this net tomorrow, I am open to similar kind of punitive measures?
Well, this is actually the problem with the return filing. Pitafi, we have to understand that FBR is crazy about this return filing concept, because if you look at the returns in terms of how much they are paying, you would be amazed to see that close to 45% of the returns which are generally filed have a zero income. So even if a person is filing for return, that does not mean that it's going to increase the return taxable income or some flow. And this is not for the first time. We have been like seeking the return filing for almost a decade now. So the problem is not just filing with the return. The problem is that FPR's compliance in terms of detecting the people's true income and in terms of creating ease for paying taxes for the people have actually not been met. So this is something which is a very real concern. Now, coming back to Sana's question in terms of the privatization receipt, again, this is something very, very surprising. She has rightly mentioned that in the budget documents, it's just 30 billion rupees. So just imagine that we are targeting a revenue base of close to 14 trillion this time. And out of the privatization, we are expecting just 30 billion. And you would be surprised to know that there is an element in the grants and transfers which is called contingent expenditures. That means that that is a liability which the government has to finance when it happens. There is an amount of 35 billion which is kept for privatization context. So what we see from outside, that the government has to actually pump in 35 billion to take out a certain bad debt or some kind of a bad asset so that the balance sheet is clean, and then they're going to recover 30 billion. So it's a net minus 5 billion receipt coming in this year, at least from the SOE's privatization. So there has to be some serious thinking that what are we selling and what's the bidding price and what's the offer price.
But Dr. Saab, could you actually clarify, we have read in the newspapers that the government has transferred PIA's liabilities to government itself, and now PIA is without liabilities. So that is not the case, or that is the case, that's why the government has put aside this sum?
Yes, this is actually the problem, that if you're taking out the liabilities of the SOEs, then the whole reason for privatizing them actually is kind of shadowed, because there is a huge cost of taking out the bad debts of these SOEs. And you would be surprised to know that the government, federal government itself, is earning close to 200 billion rupees worth of revenue from loaning to these public sector enterprises. So when they're going to write off the loans, practically that also means that some of the loans are practically again going back to the federal government. So there has to be some kind of a background analysis or homework which can really reflect that what's going to be the actual cost. Because if you're taking out the bad debts, so actually you are incurring a cost. So we should know that what's going to be the net receipts out of these SOEs privatization, which we are really not clear very much at this present stage. Now, coming to the second question of Sana in terms of the tax collection and expansion, as I earlier mentioned, that the FBR, which we hope that this year they're going to put up a good tax policy, which should reflect that what are the tax principles, how they're going to create ease of tax paying, and what kind of measures they're going to take, which is going to actually facilitate the economic growth rather than...
What's up in terms of the real estate sector?
Yeah, real estate. Now, in terms of the real estate, the problem had been that we often link it with the construction sector, and we claim that if we are going to tax the real estate, so practically that's going to put cost on the construction side as well, and which is basically getting us some jobs and some kind of a livelihood. Now, in terms of that, the government has actually increased the rates for the non-filers category, but also placed a 5% federal excise duty on all types of plots and commercial transfers which are going to happen for the new issuance of a file or a plot. So the government has actually put out a tax on that. But from the income perspective, there still needs to be some work done, because what has been happening over the years is that we had to give amnesties in the real estate where the people could declare their wealth which has been parked in that. And you must have remembered the 7E concept which the FBR actually coined in terms of taking out some income tax from the properties which the people were holding, but that is under court because this actually led the provincial governments to come out that this is their tax which the federal government is collecting. So we are still missing out the real estate income tax regime which should have been there. We charge the capital value tax, we charge the real estate transfer tax, but we are still missing out the real estate income tax, and this is something which we have to think through.
Absolutely.
Right, Sana, very
Yes.
quickly, I know Faisal, you have to actually speak. Before that, Sana, when you asked the question about real estate and Dr. Saab was responding, I misheard the word as a real estate. And somehow, while I was wondering about that, I actually thought, how true. That is actually the real estate in Pakistan now.
Yeah,
Yes,
Dr. Mahmood, we always talk about obviously, taxing the people who have money. Obviously, I'm talking about middle class and upper middle class and the elite class. They are the ones who should be paying tax in this country so that the poor or the middle class, the lower middle class, they can be facilitated in this country. When we talk about real estate, isn't it a fact that majority of the upper classes, they are the ones who are going to get taxed, and it is okay to tax them? But at the same time, should we be expecting that more tax on this sector would mean that there would be lesser opportunities for people in terms of getting jobs, and because it would actually, the tax, extra tax would actually slower down the pace of this industry, the construction industry at the same time? And then of course, we know in past the files and then the plots, they keep on rotating, and the money is made on that.
Yeah.
And of course, that is something, it's a sort of good for business as well on ground.
Before you answer that, very quickly, Faisal, why have you created 3 classes within middle class? Upper middle class, the middle class, lower middle class.
Yeah, the kind of inflation we are going through, of course, even the middle class, we have to differentiate between them.
How many
If you add it, actually, you can create
can afford
infinite number
what,
of classes, to be fair.
You'll keep on creating
Yes.
more classes
Yes,
within those
Mahmood Saab,
classes.
go ahead.
Well, actually, we are very at ease to create classes. You must have heard about the non-filer regime being extended to now a late filer. So this is practically what we do. We create classes.
What do you mean by that? What does word late mean in this? Is it late as in late, somebody late, or something else?
Well, the late means that you have just got out of your dream and you have now come to realize that you have to file the return because tomorrow is the last day.
Somebody who has passed on.
No. Actually, this is practically the context that the people use to return, file the return, because the FBR says that you would be blessed if you file the return. So they basically quickly get down and they file the return when they are going to do a transaction. So that is not going to be acceptable, and you have to be a return filer in order to be categorized as a filer. So, but on coming on the first stage, that when we should tax the business. Now, again, as I said, that the problem with the current tax regime is that you allow something to happen, and once the businesses are thriving, everybody has put their money into it, good and bad both. And finally, you have to realize that this is something now we are going to tax. So that actually creates an uncertainty, that creates a panic. I really am with this notion that everybody should be shouldering, and the equity principle is that those who are earning more should be shouldering more. But the way the FDR thinks that now they are going to tax more because now they are in need, so therefore they're going to look into the system and they're going to do some kind of a predatory taxation regime, is actually not going to work. So what we believe is that the simplest method should be that every income should be taxed. Now, the sources of income can be any, whether it's the dividend income, whether it is income from real estate, whether it is the salary income, non-salary income, rental income, be it. everybody who is earning should be paying an equal amount of tax rate which is due on them according to the slab. So rather than creating so many clauses, because that creates a complexity, that creates a problem for the savers, for the investors, for the businesses, because they have to think
Right.
that this is something good. Yeah.
Absolutely, absolutely. Yousuf Saab, I also want your perspective on a couple of sectors also that have been impacted. The EV sector and of course EV vehicles are also being impacted, and of course there are many concerns in terms of whether or not there is going to be any consumption of that matter. The of course taxation of mobile phones. Many sectors have also pointed towards how that might affect moving towards a more digitalized Pakistan, and also particularly in terms of the telecom industry not being too happy about acting as a police force in terms of the fine that is going to be that they have been instructed to put on anybody who doesn't file their taxes, and so this is important also in terms of what exactly will be the dynamics when we talk about policy matters and their implementation, and how exactly do you think that these measures are impacting these respective industries, and whether or not it's going to result in something useful.
And Yousuf Saab, if you can take my one-liner as well, and that is related to dairy products. I mean, the dairy sector is being impacted as well when it comes to obviously, increasing the tax on that side. It is not only affect the industry itself, but of course it is going to have an impact on the malnutrition notion we keep on highlighting, and of course people are going to face sort of inflation in this sector as well, and it would be not good for people at large.
I think let's first try to understand we were talking about what the middle class is. So I don't think after the last recession there's a middle class that's left in Pakistan. Out of 29 million households, 27 million households use less than 300 units of electricity. So these are people who are not buying EVs, they are not buying hybrids, and they are not buying the Nestle and Friesland Campina milk that we're talking about. These products impact those 2 million households that consume more than 300 units of electricity. So these two steps, firstly, they don't impact a very large portion of the population. They impact a few people, the people that we meet and the people that we hang out with, but they don't impact the larger population. With regards to the increased taxation on hybrid cars, yes, there will most likely be an immediate decline in sales for a few months. And the auto sector has been slow for quite a few years because of deval, because of interest rate increases, but things will normalize gradually. I think if the government has decided that it wants to impose a 25% tax or an 18% tax on these cars, so it's not going to matter in the long term. Once interest rates gradually come down, car sales will pick back up. The other thing that's important is that these new hybrid cars, especially the ones in the new auto policy, these cars are also not localized. These are cars made completely with imported parts. So the overall impact on the economy is not going to be as much. So if somebody buys a car from another company that has localized more, I think that's going to be more beneficial to the economy rather than buying these EV and hybrid cars. The second question was with regards to the telecom sector with policing. I think this has been a very good step. I know people who have started running around to try to file their tax returns because the telecom sector has been asked to police them. I think everyone needs a cell phone. I think the government should use every way possible to bring people into the tax net. But the problem is that the T-boy at our office, his SIM got blocked, which was extremely funny for all of us because with his salary, makes no sense for his SIM to get blocked. And with regards to the whole,
it's sad, not funny, right?
it's both sad and funny. I think there is so much that has happened in this country that it's now funny.
Okay, Dr. Mahmood, at the start of this discussion, you actually told us that this budget is very ambitious, both in collection side and expenditure side. And then we are told that we are taking IMF on board, and if the bourses in the country, if the stock market is any indicator, then of course we are expecting some kind of good news. So IMF is okay with this kind of ambitious targets on both sides, which might not be met eventually.
And also, Mahmood Saab, last question with regards to poverty alleviation and the impact on the poor segments of society. While we talk about all of the impacts that different changes are going to create, we see an increase, of course, in the BISP budget. But will it be enough? And whether or not this strategy is actually successful in light of all of the rest of the burden that keeps on increasing?
Well, I'll take the second question first. The BISP budget has been increased. But again, the problem, Sana, is that just doling out more money is not going to help the people graduate out of the poverty. Until and unless there is economic growth happening in the economy, we cannot have these cushions running for long. Whenever there is a crisis, economic crisis, generally the government should be supporting the people for a very short run period, whereas the people are going into the poverty, they are being given some support and then they come out. But unfortunately, in case of the BISP, its enrollment is increasing every year. So we have to really think about how we are dealing with this poverty phenomena and how long we can sustain pumping this amount of money, because there are problems, as earlier also mentioned, that that money is actually borrowed because all of our taxes actually go to the interest payment. So there is a huge cost involved. Now, coming to the first question of Farooq in terms of how IMF would respond to this budget. IMF generally looks into the overall targets, and from that perspective, the targets are very good because we have proposed that we are going to have a very bumper tax collection this year, and we are going to have expenditures which at least from the opening words of the minister is going to be reforms oriented. Then they are going to be curtailed to an extent. They have mentioned department to be closed down as well. But if the IMF was to go a bit deep into the details of the budget, then they would also see that this is a kind of a budget which we generally refer to as a pro rata budget, where the numbers are just increased and you can see that there is tinkering in the budget. But the problem I suspect that they're going to come out with is, and again, as mentioned earlier as well, the size of the public sector development program. This is close to 1.4 trillion. This is 150% over and above. We cannot sustain this type of investment because whenever we are pumping money through the PSDP, that means the recurrent budget is going to increase in the coming years because the public assets developed needs to be managed. They have to be maintained and others. So this is something which is really worrisome for us.
Absolutely. Thank you very much, Dr. Mahmood, Khalid, and of course, Mr. Yousuf, Farooq, for joining us and being a part of the discussion and talking to us at length about the country's economy. And we hope, of course, we're going to be moving in the right direction, particularly with the IMF. We're now going to be taking a look at our next segment that takes a closer look at what is happening on ground politically, and especially in Punjab, with Section 144 being imposed, and of course, with reference to the way that many different issues with regards to the PTI and the current government, and of course, the jailed founder have been existing for quite some time now, and what exactly is going to be the future in this regard. Farrukh, do you think the situation is worrisome for the government, or should be a cause of concern, considering we've had calls for nationwide protests previously as well, but then again, we've had incidents of May 9th also?
Right, Sana, thank you very much for the question. I think that first of all, because we are responding or reacting to Section 144 being imposed in Punjab for 7 days, first of all, we have to look at the notice itself, which actually states no reason particularly regarding these protests. It is not particularly about PTI for that matter. Of course, it mentions law and order situation and the possibility of elements which are like terrorists or others who might be targeting such activities when people gather. So I think that that is a concern that is recurring, and that is a serious one, and nobody should make light of that, right? But regarding PTI's call for protest, that is again quite an interesting thing. I mean, I think it was Einstein who said doing the same thing over and over and expecting different results is the definition of madness. Now, the problem with PTI is that it has repeatedly called for protest, and how many people show up, Sana? I mean, on May 9th, they might have actually created quite a havoc. But apart from that, after that, how many people have showed up? They don't. Why? Because when they knew they are in safe space, that is on the election day, they showed up and they gave the vote. Now it was, up to PTI to make the best out of whatever they were given. And what did they do? They refused to negotiate with anybody. They did not negotiate with PMLN. They did not negotiate with People's Party, which was heavily hinting that they can form government together. And eventually they ended up, maneuvering themselves into this narrow alleyway, where they are not actually getting out of that very quickly. Now, if you want to keep on disrupting, there is law of diminishing returns. People give you votes because they think you are smart enough to use them constructively or leverage them. If you can't do that and you keep on bleeding leverage every day, I mean, with disruption, with protest, what benefit can they get out of that now when they are in a hugely compromised position?
Absolutely. Faisal, of course, when we talk about the current situation politically also, there are many other factors, of course, impacting the country, and of course many that are emerging from the neighborhood also. And so we're going to be also taking a look at, of course, the kind of rhetoric and statements that have been coming in, or the campaign that has existed to malign the ex-army officer, Brigadier retired Mr. Amir Hamza, who unfortunately was assassinated. And so this is, of course, something which is extremely troubling, both in terms of how this is being projected and what sort of false accusations are being put forward. You have also tweeted at length about the issue as well. What exactly is your perspective on that, and what is the truth?
Yes, and obviously when we look at this particular story of, which has been highlighted by Indian media, and of course they took it from social media and they have been propagating against Pakistan and Pakistan military, and we know that they have been doing it since long time, and majority of their stories are Bollywood kind of stories, concocted stories, and they have no truth on ground at all. This particular story of Brigadier retired Amir Hamza, he got retired in 2016. He was an artillery officer. He had never ever served in any of the branches of intelligence, and after getting retired, he served Pakistan Civil Sector 1122 service, which is of course emergency service of Pakistan, and he has been serving that. And then later on he went to DHA Lahore, and he served there until 2021, and that is what his whole story was. And here in this incident, he was shot, and then of course he was traveling with his wife and daughter. Both of them, they are out of danger now. They were injured as well in this incident, and so far the investigation is taking place. It was more of a robbery kind of incident, but why India is using that is more important. Right now India is facing too many questions which are being raised by their own people, and government has no answers to it. Why? Because firstly, the footages comes from the Europe, NYPD actually holding the hand and handcuffs Nikhil Gupta, and he was taken to America to face his trial.
Gupta or Gill?
Gupta. Okay. Nikhil Gupta is being taken to USA to face the trial related to, we have been highlighting about how they have been trying to assassinate the Khalistan movement leaders, and this is what they have been doing, and we have given them a particular name, and that is of Rogue Assassins Wing, RAW. These are raw people who have been taken from a European country and then taken to USA. And the next news comes from where? Australia. 5 of their diplomats who are pretending to be diplomats in Australia, Indian diplomats, they have been expelled from Australia, and they have been sent back to their own country. And both of these countries, they are actually allies of India they are Quad allies of India. And now I'm expecting that the similar kind of situation would be erupting from Japan side as well, because Japan is the only Quad ally which is left, from where they have to actually bring their own raw assassins back to their country.
Right.
This is what the real story is. They just want to give bit of hope to their own country on the wrong side. This is an incident, a daylight incident which has taken place, and of course it was a robbery kind of incident, and they have made it look like as if they have been sending their spies into Pakistan, and somehow they have been assassinating intelligence officers who've been involved in incidents in Kashmir and Indian illegally occupied Jammu and Kashmir. And this has been taking place in past as well, and now too, that India always comes up with these kind of concocted stories and nothing else.
Right. Yes, Farrukh.
Number one, clever idea, further indicting yourself when you are being already being accused of involvement in other countries. Number two, regarding the operations, we know that Guardian actually came up with a report during the elections that India has been involved in killing people in Pakistan. But apart from that, Australia's ABC, Australian Broadcasting Corporation, actually on Monday came up with a report on how India is abusing its privileges in Four Eyes countries, right? Apart from that, something very interesting is happening. And that is, I don't know why we are responding to Indian propaganda, because who takes Indian media serious anymore?
Yeah.
Not the world, not Indians. And they have shown you in the elections that they don't care much about their mad media. So why should we?
Yeah.
Right, absolutely. Thank you, Farrukh, and thank you, Faisal, for joining us and being a part of the discussion. As always, that's the end from the debate. And of course, we'll be back with more news next week. Have a nice weekend.